Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This episode is the second part of two of my interview with Derek Guy. In the first part, we talked about the history of liberalism and the history of men's fashion and dress norms, and how those two have interacted with each other. In this part, we talk about what that all means. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that we now live in a society that has much greater pluralism of ways of dressing and presenting yourself, and what that tells us or how that interacts with liberal ideas of freedom? We then get into a more general discussion of the individualist versus communitarian strains within liberalism, or the communitarian critiques of liberalism from the outside. And Derek puts some questions to me, and I do my best to sort of give my views there. So this is a much more open conversation, but I hope an interesting one. These are things I've talked about a lot on the podcast. So yeah, you might want to check out the first part if you haven't already for a bit of context of this conversation. But, you know, if you don't care too much about context, you're welcome to just join us here. I think that's about it for introduction. I'll say briefly, I talk a bit about liberalism in this episode. If you want even more on that, we reference the liberty principle a bit. I have a solo episode just on that I really go into depth on. I also did an interview on Mac Taxman's podcast, Elucidations, on John Stuart Mill, which is also available on this podcast stream. I think it's just called An Introduction to John Stuart Mill, which is exactly what it sounds like. So if you're interested in more on the sort of liberalism that I'm defending here, there's just a lot in the podcast stream. So just have a look around if you're interested in hearing more. Apart from that, let's get straight to it. This is Freedom and Fashion with Derek Guy. So I guess though, but to the challenge would be, right, because one of the things people have pushed back on you for is like, oh, you say, you know, you're a menswear person, you're knowledgeable about this. Clearly the suit looks better, and clearly modern fashion isn't as good, and yet you say it is no bad thing. Indeed, it may be a very good thing that we've lost the suit. The challenge maybe could be structured along the lines of, isn't it the case, though, that we've simply lost a clear set of rules that people can sort of, you know, you don't wear a white shirt. Black and white, literally. You can tell whether you're following it or not. For a much more opaque and harder to follow set of rules, isn't the clearer one better? Because it just at least has the virtue of simplicity. And I guess the answer would start with, well, there are now multiple different sort of there are now multiple different systems that you can participate in, and having that choice is good. Would that be your thought to answer that challenge?
My answer to that question is a little bit complicated. There are many people who think that just because I do like suits, I do like actually many different aesthetics. I don't actually only like suits, but they assume that since I like suits, that I want everyone to dress in a suit. On this issue of like having clear rules versus living in this vaguer system, I also have different preferences in terms of like what I value in society. And I do like that we have greater freedoms today. And I can't imagine that we could have had the sexual and gender revolutions of the last, let's say, 75 years, while still confining men to two-piece suits and women to sundresses. As we noted, the shifts in liberalism and political culture and economic systems shapes how people dress. And it's hard to imagine how you could have all of those cultural revolutions, those political freedoms, while still confining everyone to that kind of aesthetic. So I value that more than I value aesthetics. But more importantly, this democratization of who counts in our society, I think also allows us to draw from a wider range of inspiration. So, as we've kind of very simplified, but I think reasonably correctly laid out, the movement from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men counting in the demos to working classes, non-white groups, women, and then moving forward, how that shapes dress. I think all of that allows us to say there are different legitimate forms of lifestyle. And since lifestyle is tied to dress, there are now different legitimate forms of aesthetics. They may not be considered quote unquote good taste. They are not part of the ruling class, but they are considered legitimate. And I think the legitimization of those lifestyles, which then connects to aesthetics, means that we have a greater pool of inspiration to draw from. So someone like me, who cares a great deal about clothes, lives in a richer, more interesting world. I will admit that someone who, and then also for someone like my dad who does not care about clothes, it doesn't make any difference for him. But there is a person who has minimal interest in clothes but wants to dress better, and now this is a much more confusing world. They neither have the clear set of rules that existed in the early 20th century when dress was governed by time, place, and occasion with a layer of social status or social position, we should say. Um, but the somehow some stuff still matters. You can still be excluded in some ways, especially in areas where it counts, like professional settings, but it's very vague. And then now this person has, there's more of a burden on them to figure out how to put together a wardrobe. They then have to choose a language, figure out the grammatical rules, which are never ever really clearly spelled out for them. There's no like clear book, and the rules are often always changing. Um, that person, I think, is put in a worse position, I will admit. And then something that I often note is that in this world where we consume clothes as identity, clothes have always been about identity, but we try on different clothes to essentially kind of play with different identities, express sometimes aspirational identities, and the rules are always changing. It ends up meaning that people cycle through many more clothes. In the early 20th century, a man might only have, like two suits and three shirts with like four detachable collars. And these clothes were repaired. I mean, that's partly economic. I mean, people spent a lot more on clothes and clothing was much more precious. Cloth was much more precious. And the Industrial Revolution has made clothes much cheaper, which allowed different designs to flourish. And then also people to try on different identities. And, it would be no big deal. If you bought something from Shein today, it's like $5 for a t-shirt or even like a button-up shirt. And if it didn't work out, you're probably not even going to return it because it would be more of a hassle for you to return it than waste $5. That's how cheap clothing is now. In that sense, there is also an ecological problem where people cycle through so much clothing because they're trying different identities, they're trying to figure out the language, the world is much bigger, that there's also an ecological impact. There's often a statistic cited in it, and I've never been able to find the source of the statistic, but it's often bandied about even in like UN publications that fashion is the largest polluter in the world, and they give all this like these statistics that I don't think anyone has any real hard data for. But I think most people can agree that if fashion's not the number one polluter, it's at least pretty high up there because many people's closets are bursting. They have more clothes than they could. Many people could stop buying clothes today and still have enough clothes to wear for the rest of life, assuming that their body doesn't change. Um, that's how much we're swimming in clothes. And I think that has dramatic ecological, environmental impacts. And I think that is bad. Um, so that is a downside to this vaguer world. it is certainly a richer place for someone like me who wants to see all of these different aesthetics, and they don't want to see men only wear white shirts and suits all the time. They want to see a workwear aesthetic, and they want to see, avant-garde aesthetics. They want to see all these different aesthetics. But the world is much more confusing for that consumer that's somewhere between my dad not caring at all and wears the same clothes for 30, 40 years, and then someone like me who takes great pleasure in seeing these different things.
One note, and then I'm going to draw us back to a sort of core theme, is I was reading a historian called Brett Devereaux who did some back of the sort of envelope math to work out, back in the day when peasants would just weave their own clothes from wool, like the amount of labour that went into that. And he came up with the figure that to produce 2 outfits for every member of a six-member family every year, so essentially get a new set of clothes in the winter and one in the summer, would be 100 hours of work a week, every week. Like that, when people are like, medieval peasants used to work less than us. No, they didn't. So, there's got to be somewhere between that and fast fashion. But where I wanted to maybe circle us back to, we've used the word, both of us, a number of times now, it's maybe sort of worth thinking about it a bit, is freedom. We sort of say, and it seems to make sense, we are now more free, with a sort of greater pluralism. I want to maybe just spend a couple of minutes talking through why liberals think freedom is a good thing, and then maybe invite you to pick up some of those points to the sort of mixed picture that you were painting of both the sort of gains and the negatives from a greater degree of choice in the fashion world. Because in many ways what you're talking about are the costs and the consequences of freedom. And one of the questions we don't ask a lot is, well, why is freedom good? We know broadly that freedom is associated with non-constraint, it's associated with choice-making, it's often associated with non-domination, not being under anyone's thumb. But, why is that a good thing? There are many societies that would not have thought that was a good thing, and there are many people today who, I think, implicitly or explicitly don't. To my mind, your sort of clearest account of this is John Stuart Mill's. And I find this really interesting because he very much stresses the pluralist side of freedom and the necessity of living in a society, not just being left alone, but living in a society with a lot of pluralism and a lot of difference being a necessary prerequisite for freedom. And so I find that interesting to think about, in that many ways we are, to some degree, achieving the world that he wanted 150 years ago. And he points to, I would say, 3 principal benefits to that. The first, he would say, is making choices isn't good for its own sake. It's good for people. We are improved by thinking and acting for ourselves, as this forces us to use our distinctively human capacities. He has this idea of, by choosing your life plan, you're using your reasoning, judgment, determination, and that makes you a better person to have to decide how you navigate the world. There's also that idea of progress, but on a social level. Free speech is good because we don't want to be shutting down the next great idea or the next scientific advance. But Mill also applies this to society, and he says we want people to experiment with different modes of living and different lifestyles, because you might discover something that's actually really freaking great, and then other people will pick up. And then finally, this idea of, like I said, you want to live in a pluralist society because that in itself increases choice and gives people more options. It's one thing to say you're free to do whatever you want, but if there's no one else out there living that life, it's very hard to imagine taking the first step. To take a modern example, there's all the difference in the world between saying you're free to be gay and no one will stop you, but not living in a society where anyone else has a non-heterosexual lifestyle openly. That would be, I think, in some sense, if nobody else did it openly, even if you were free to in theory, that would be that would be a constraint on your freedom. That's sort of the vision. That's really, to my mind, the high classical liberal vision of freedom, is that choice is good. It both develops people and it develops societies. It's forward-looking. And also it's self-reinforcing. Choice enables more choice by allowing people to strike out different paths. You live in a society where you can see the results of choice and you can decide what you want. And to all of that, the enemy for Mill was conformity. That was just the idea of a grinding down. And he would see someone dressed outrageously and say, great. The more eccentricity you can have in society, the better. So, I don't know, I wanted to outline that as a vision, not just of what freedom is, but what freedom does. What's the point of this thing? And invite you to maybe line up any of those points with the sort of debate that we're having.
The funny thing is that when I was a terrible student in high school. I only graduated high school because I essentially flunked out, and the school did not want to deal with me coming back, so they got set up a summer school program that I could take that then qualified me to pass. And I got interested in academics partly because I read Mill and I was so excited. I remember being a young person and jumping up and down reading On Liberty. I was so excited by reading him and then his writings on political economy and so forth. Um, I agree with Mill's views as it pertains to all of the more important kind of lifestyle, political, and economic choices. I don't share I don't think those three goods of freedom apply to clothing, partly because I don't think there's a theological end to clothing. I don't think that we necessarily improve on clothing. And it's not like we're all marching towards an ultimate truth in clothing. I do think that allowing different people to live different lifestyles allows, as I noted earlier, those lifestyles then end up creating different aesthetics, and then we have different languages. And it's nice to have different languages because then people can choose what's exciting for them. The one point that as I grew older, I became a bit more of a liberal skeptic. I only became more of a liberal after in the last, I would say, maybe 8 or 10 years. But for a while, I was a bit of a liberal skeptic because I didn't necessarily believe in Mill's conception or many other liberals' conception that all of these desires are necessarily innate within us. And I felt that liberalism can sometimes make people feel very alienated and very alone. That without community, without people directing you towards certain goals, and without feeling like you're part of a group and that you have status and you're valued within that group, um, that kind of that feeling can give life sense of meaning or purpose and can direct your desires so that you have a constrained number of choices. In that sense, I became a bit more of a communitarian for a while. That's what drew me, as we were talking about earlier, that's what drew me into many kind of reading liberal and communitarian philosophers debate each other. That's what drew me into that debate. And then bringing it back to fashion. That's why I partly feel that the world is much more confusing for the fashion consumer. And as you were talking about the proliferation of these choices, I think about this book that I often cite when in my writing and when people interview me. Barry Schwartz I believe he was a professor of business at UC Berkeley. I don't know if he still teaches there, but he wrote a book called The Paradox of Choice. And his book basically opens up with a story of him going to the Gap to buy a pair of jeans. He goes inside the Gap, and the sales associate asks him, Do you want slim straight jeans? Do you want relaxed fit? Do you want athletic fit? Do you want slim taper? Do you want raw? Do you want rinse? Do you want wash? Do you want 5-year wash? Do you want pure cotton? Do you want cotton stretch? I gave him all these options. And he said he walked out that day with the best pair of jeans that he's ever purchased, because before that he thought jeans were just jeans, that you just, there's only one thing. He went in, he found all these choices, and he bought the best pair of jeans that he's ever purchased. But he left feeling more dissatisfied than he's ever felt, because once faced with all those choices, he started to wonder, did I make the right one at the Gap? And then also, what other choices are there? If there are, let's say, 20 choices at the Gap, then there must be 20 more at another store. And then you fold that out, there's maybe 2,000 choices on the market. And maybe there's an even better pair of jeans. And to some degree, maybe it's not good to feel that way. Maybe it's better to have your choices very constrained, so that an analogous would be like you go to the Apple store, and assuming that you've already decided to choose Apple, then there's only like 3 iPhones. Do you want this one, or that one? And presumably all the choices are good. Someone has narrowed the choices for you. I assume whoever runs Apple is not thinking that one of the iPhones is actually really bad, but they're constraining your choices so that you feel less anxious and you leave feeling a little bit more confident. And in some ways, I think dress is also benefits a little bit from that. When your choices are a little bit constrained explicitly, and then someone says, okay, like, let's just figure out, here are your 3 choices, like, figure it out. And then hopefully they're all good choices. You are then not left constantly cycling through 1,000 chinos and 10,000 shirts. And then you figure out, like, what are all the different combinations? And some of those combinations may be bad. And then even if you get the right combination, you wonder, can I even improve my style? Is there a teleological end where I have the ultimate personal style, where I look the best as I possibly could? These choices end up making one, it can, as Barry Schwartz noted, when faced with too many choices, people can have paralysis and they end up not choosing at all. There's many people who note this of healthcare plans, that people are often better off if they only have 3 choices in healthcare plans, because if they're faced with limitless choices, then they push the decision off to the next day when they can do more research, and then they end up not choosing anything at all, at which point, like, something bad happens and then you really do need a healthcare plan. So there's paralysis of choice, and then even if you choose, there's anxiety over whether your choice was the right one, and then anxiety over whether there are better choices that are unknown. But overall, I do agree with Mill's general ideas of freedom. I do think it's worth questioning, in that model, how do we conceptualize the individual, either how do we conceptualize the individual's relationship with the community? Does the individual, is there something in, because in Mill's setup, there's an individual that exists. And that individual has certain desires and preferences and personalities, and they choose the community that's right for them. So that if there is a crazy, wacky community, and there's a conservative community, and there's a, I don't know, something in between community, like you choose I'm this personality, and I'm going to go to the crazy community. But sometimes your personality and your desires and habits and all of that are decided by the community that you're within, and it's the community that gives you meaning, and it's the community that determines this thing around you. There was a time where I started to, again, as I noted, become thinking a little bit more about communitarianism. I remember a bit of a funny story. First time I came across ideas of communitarianism was in a sociology class. And as I was reading, all of these philosophers, I was thinking, like, oh, this actually makes sense. I think at the time I was already very becoming a little bit more of a liberal skeptic, and thinking that liberalism ends up making people feel alienated. And when I was reading communitarianism, I was thinking, this is, like, actually, I think, putting some language around what I've been skeptical about in communitarianism, that even as communitarians note, like, you need some type of structures to get people to do things, that the liberal can never justify to the voter why they should vote, because logically your vote probably won't matter in national elections. Probably not. I mean, most likely it's not going to come down to your single vote. So as the communitarian notes that like you have to depend on ideas of like national responsibility, civic duty, and in order to do that, you need some type of like group identity. You need some kind of bounds to say like you are this person. This is what you owe to the group. And I started to becoming a little bit more of a communitarian. But I remember the professor saying communitarians are the type of people that insist on community, but are never the type of people you want to be in a community with. Which I thought was funny because when I was in that class, I was secretly a communitarian. Um, but in Mill's kind of structure, I think it's worth thinking over his conceptualization of the individual and whether or not our relationship, or the individual's relationship with the community, and where all these desires and personalities and their desire for status, their desire for like where did those desires come from? Does it come from their expression of status? To me, is likely embedded within group norms and cultures. I am now somewhat in between a liberal and a communitarian. I think my views are somewhere in between those two extremes. And it is good to think of some protections for minorities outside of group enforcement. But yeah, to bring it back to fashion, I think I believe in Mill's conception of freedom in that it allows for different flourishing of different lifestyles and therefore gives us more aesthetic language. But then I disagree that there's a theological end in fashion and even many other things, frankly. Um, and then for the first point that you brought up of the individuals, it's good to have choices. Sometimes having a lot of choices is bad. Um, it freezes you up and makes you anxious. And sometimes your choices benefit from being constrained. And sometimes your desires are defined by a group. And sometimes that can be good.
Yes, so, okay, I'm going to say a bit about this, and then, you can pick up on any element of which. I would say for the three things I laid out with Mill, I'd say the last one of, like, you want to see different life paths lived before you clearly works for fashion. Like, in the world today, certainly in the world of a generation ago, there was, like, a goth aesthetic or a punk aesthetic or, like, your classical suit aesthetic, and you can see that lived out and sort of have it as an example for you. I think that one clearly works. I think the social progress one works for some stuff. I would say it probably doesn't work for dress for the exact reason that you outlined. In what would it even mean for, like, we can think about scientific progress or even moral progress. What would, like...
Yes.
What would we even mean by fashion progress, right? I think the first one kind of works. I think... But I think one point to make, and that does clearly relate to fashion, is that Mill's vision of choice is a very demanding one, for, like, the reasons that you outline, in that you can very well imagine people saying, but I don't want to grow or self-develop or improve myself as a person and use these distinctive human faculties, and, like, can you not please just tell me whether I need to wear the white shirt or the blue shirt?
Maybe that explains the growth of my account.
But, like, I remember a while ago, my wife just said to me, I want to go on a weekend away, and I don't really care, can you just sort it? Like, there was no, like, oh, let's look at all the different choices, and, like, I want to, like, really explore the different options and exercise my higher capacities as a human being. She's like, I can't be bothered. Can you just do the thinking bit? And I feel like anyone who's in a long-term relationship, you have these moments where you're like, the mental labour of this, would you mind just handle? Almost like you say, can you just do the dishes? It's like, could you just do the thinking here? I think that's right. I feel like Mill can just double down and say, yeah, liberalism is demanding. That's kind of the point. This is not... And I think... one of the things as liberalism has become a part of, and I say a part of, the status quo, is we've sort of accepted as a background condition, rather than, like, democracy too, and both of these are systems that sort of require a sort of active participatory role. I'll say one more thing about, like, the sort of structure of, is this just So philosophers would call this your social ontology. So in other words, what are your baseline assumptions about what actually exists in the world and what is real? So you can imagine a purely individualist social ontology, which says, really, in Margaret Thatcher's famous words, there's no such thing as society. There are only individuals and individuals forming groups, right? That is a purely individualist social ontology. In some meaningful sense, individuals are real and social groups aren't. I think what's happened with... So let me say this first. Firstly, I agree, a purely individualist social ontology isn't tenable, for some of the reasons you outlined, and many more, in fact. I think what's happened with liberalism is we tend to interpret early liberalism through the lens of contemporary neoliberalism or libertarianism, which is sort of an offshoot of liberalism that comes in quite early on, even by Mill's day. He's distinguishing himself from figures like Herbert Spencer and so on. And then as you get into the 20th century, you have figures like Hayek and von Mises and so on, who are kind of very much separate from liberalism and often joining with conservatism in critique of liberalism. But what will happen is those ideas will really get their heyday in the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions. And mainline liberalism will in many ways sort of acquiesce to them a little. But what's certainly happened is the neoliberals have successfully claimed liberalism's heritage, as it were. They've said we're the true descendants of Mill and Adam Smith and so on, in a way that now, in really I would say the last 10 years, has generated considerable pushback. I just interviewed Matt McManus on a book about liberal socialism. Jacob Levy is someone else on the social justice side you might bring in there. All sorts of people that have sort of pushed back and said, no, early liberalism doesn't have, I mean, just to take your case, doesn't have a purely individualist social ontology. I don't think Mill does. And indeed, if you get to a sort of early welfare state liberalism of Hobson or Hobhouse, not only do they not think individuals are not the only thing that counts, in Hobson's account, they don't exist at all. All that matters is society. Now, we have individual rights and freedoms because they're good for society, because it enables I mean, these are people who think society is alive, almost like it's an organism. It's just wildly. And where we would now use the language of atoms and a sort of Newtonian language of like discrete units orbiting in predictable patterns as our social ontology. They used the language of evolution. They thought that society was literally a creature, which seems a bit wild to us, but I'm sure our social descriptions will seem wild to people 100 years from now. The point...
Is Hobbes not taking the individual as the starting point, since he sees that society emerges out of... Hobbes House. Okay, sorry.
Hobbes, you have something closer to a pure individualist negative liberty view, but he's also 300 years earlier.
Right.
But what Mill does is people always get focused on the individualist side of Mill, which is certainly there, and as far as a sort of like, I want to do my own thing, Mill is type A, right? He also talks about society having, and I quote, rights and interests. So not just like society exists to protect its members, but society as an ontologically real category can be ascribed rights and can be ascribed interests, which is not a particularly modern way of talking about it. So where you said you landed is where I land, but I would frame it differently. You said I'm kind of somewhere between a communitarian and a liberal. I mean, I think everyone who's thought about it kind of is, right? You will get pure libertarians, and you will get, like, pure, like, authoritarians, I guess. But A mature liberalism, I think, is kind of a balancing act between the two. And one of the central projects of liberalism is to try and think about how we get the best of both. And I would say that is the Millite project. What he's trying to do in On Liberty isn't trying to assert the individual over society, although a lot of it will read like that. He's trying to say what's the dividing line. And the dividing line, you can debate whether he gets it right, but is this liberty principle, which is, to the extent you're not directly harming someone else, that's the private sphere, that should be unregulated. But there's another side of that, which is, to the extent that your actions can harm others, and Mill would include stuff like trade as something that can potentially harm others, you are accountable to society as an ontologically real category. So to the early liberals, I think our understanding of them has been sort of impoverished by, and this is being pushed back on now, the assumption of them as pure individualists. That's very much a lens of our modern age. I think they're not. I think they're trying to do what you're talking about, which is to say, well, surely both of these things matter. And it's like, but they also seem to pull in different directions, and how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, I would say that well, in practice, we're still negotiating how we uh, how we think of the individual and the group. But many people do philosophically land on Mill's principle, which is, as long as you're not harming someone else, it should be allowed, and especially for many modern day liberals. But essentially, the problem with that is, as we're talking about, at least to the degree that this we're still talking about fashion, although I'm very interested in the bounds of this conversation outside of fashion. Um, Doing something that is not necessarily harming someone else, but is essentially watering down group identity. If you have one single group, and we all say that we're a Christian group, and we view Christianity in this way, and this means that we live our lifestyle in this way, and we practice things in this way. If one individual within that group says, I'm either lazy and I don't want to do this particular practice, or I want to interpret something differently, and I am breaking off as kind of, an offshoot of this group, or I'm maybe even watering down the bounds of this group. This essentially, I think, wouldn't you say that that's essentially many modern liberals? Is this idea that you should be allowed to do that? Um, the non-harm
Yes,
principle?
but yes, and I think Mill bites the bullet there. I think there is, and Mill definitely is clear on this, forms of active participation within the group that are required on Mill's view. So you have to contribute to the basic structure that allows freedom and makes it possible. So Mill would have no problem,
Yeah.
say, with compulsory jury duty, or having to pay taxes to support education or other public goods. Or, I would argue this, maybe not a legal commandment to, but certainly a sort of social norm of participating in democratic norms, like voting. That's a sort of collective responsibility, because yes, on a purely individualistic level, the chance of your vote being determinative is functionally zero. But if nobody did it, the whole thing would fall apart. And so there are
Right.
there are obligations in Mill's view to keep the thing running. I think he'd separate that out from and liberalism always has a hard time with this, is like, exactly where do you put it? In Rawls, he would talk about like comprehensive life plans versus sort of like a thin conception of the good. Like, you're allowed to strike out on your own path, but there's this kind of like inner citadel of stuff that we all have to agree on. I think liberalism often imperfectly distinguishes between those two things, but it does attempt to distinguish.
In watering down that group identity, do we not wind up with the same issues as we were discussing earlier with both communitarians and the idea of alienation with liberals, that you, as you water down the group identity, individuals can feel more anxious and alienated, and as to the degree that it relates to fashion, are faced with an increasing number of vague rules and consumer choices?
I think that's certainly a critique of liberalism. I think it's a critique that's been run of. I mean, this is a line that's been run against liberalism for a long time. I think there's a sort of high form of it and a low form of it. My instinct as a sort of card-carrying liberal has always to be somewhat dismissive of that, but I think the very fact that people keep on bringing it up and it keeps on resonating with people means that you can't be totally dismissive of it. I mean, to maybe flip it though, I would say, are we judging liberalism against some perfect society, or are we judging it against the realistic alternatives? Because people talk about liberalism fails to provide meaning, and it often does, but then I doubt that the medieval peasant who was spending 100 hours a week weaving their own lives, that their life was particularly filled with meaning, you know? I think that the challenge, if it is, can't be just that there are people dissatisfied and alienated under liberalism. There are people who are going to be dissatisfied and alienated under any social ordering. And I'll go further, even under the best form of liberalism, there are people who won't have buy-in and do have to be corralled. There will in any liberal society be non-liberals who have to be corralled along the way. I think the challenge, if it's to work, has to be there's something specifically about liberalism that's driving this kind of restless malaise that people claim to find in the world. And the story would be, like you said, in that it is too much choice. And, you know, instead of you go into the appliances store and there's 3 faucets and there's like a hideously ornate one, a minimalist one, and one that's kind of somewhere between, and you go, I like the one that's somewhere in between. It's now like, oh, let's custom design this according to 100 variables. And actually, people would be happier if you just gave them a faucet. I see that story and I get that story. I think my thought is I don't think the answer to that is to go back to one overriding set of group norms. I think there is something to the Millite idea of living in a pluralistic and varied society is good, and it's nice that I rub along side by side with people who dress and think and eat and talk differently to me. I think that's good for me. I think there is a negotiation which is always going to be challenging to find in practice, of like, how many models of life are we putting in front of people? So like, when I was growing up, you know, you were gay or you were straight, and we maybe didn't have brilliant attitudes about gay people, but it's like 2 things and you pick one, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And then we kind of had this idea of, oh, maybe there's people who are kind of a bit of both, we'll call that bisexual. Okay, 3 things, can still wrap your head around it. And then, you know, there's this much mocked, like, chart of 74 genders. And, like...
Yeah.
And I don't think that's bad, per se. Like, I think if someone really wants, just to be clear, like, if someone really wants, like, a fully customised gender and sexual identity that's kind of, like, not easily captured by either gay, straight, or bi, I don't have a problem with that. But I do think at a certain point the amount of choice breaks down, and it almost goes back to like you want models and paradigms that people can live into. I'll also say, just finally on this point, that I do think liberalism is an ongoing conversation and an ongoing it's an ongoing set of reconciling the irreconcilable. Liberalism is an attempt to reconcile the individual and the community, which don't ever fully reconcile. It's also an attempt to reconcile order and stability with change, which again don't ever fully reconcile. And the ways we have these conversations will always be different as societies change and technology changes and whatever. But I don't think you give up on the conversation. I don't think you give up on liberalism and just go, well, it's all too hard, we all just need to be Christians. It is hard, and it is a demanding creed, and I think both liberalism and democracy ask more of the people in their societies than I think is commonly realised. But I don't think the answer then is to go, well, it's really hard to reconcile the individual and society, so it's just all society, I know that was very long, but that's kind of how I think about that set of concerns.
No, I agree. I mean, I've become much more liberal in the last 10 years, seeing the rise of. There was a period where I thought, like, is liberalism alienating? Does it give too many choices? Is it anxiety inducing? Is so on and so forth? Does it water down? Like, is it good to have community norms that pressure you into doing certain things and a sense of belonging? And then there was the rise of, like, it's hotly debated on how much influence this kind of idea has, but there's certainly in some areas where it's very identifiable, there has been some sections of political discourse that are overtly about white nationalism. And it's to say that we are asserting both an ethnic kind of, we want an ethno-state, and we want a religious state, and we want very defined, narrow practices of gender and sexuality and all of that. And that's when I started to become more liberal. I was like, oh, okay, well, like, I'm not that. Like, whatever I think of all of this political philosophy, I am, like, ethnically not that. I live in this country. I am certain things, and I will certainly be excluded from that group in a way that I can never even opt into, and I don't even philosophically believe in, and politically believe in. And then I started to think, like, I do buy into this idea of Mill's pluralism, and his idea of liberal pluralism. It's just, there are times, as you noted, like, perhaps it's true, like, you can never really solve that. Maybe alienation is, like, innate in human existence. Anxiety and alienation are just, like, part of being human, and we just ascribe it to the liberal order because that's the order that we live.
I do.
There is a part of me that just thinks that as we build out all these different lifestyles, there's a consumer aspect where people try on different identities in terms of fashion, where then there is an environmental impact. And that part is worrisome, although it's not worrisome enough for me to then think that we should just put white nationalists in power.
Yeah, and so I mean, I will say, in liberalism's, I'll be brief because this has already been a while, but in liberalism's defense, I think modern liberalism as it actually exists is sort of a mass social belief system that is so much more environmentally focused than it was. One of the big, that is just like one of the big defining things, is a focus on climate change and sustainability and so on. And, liberalism is criticised in that sometimes that can be a bit affected and a bit symbolic and, like, maybe all sorts of critiques there. But I think liberalism has generally moved towards a much more sort of pro-green position. I think one thing modern liberalism is not particularly good at is it's not particularly good at thinking about status as a form of power on its own terms. I think, we've had this debate within liberalism, basically since the founding, of, like, how egalitarian should we be? Should we, and if so, how much, redistribute money from the rich to the poor? All that sort of thing. And liberalism, even in its sort of more modern, more centrist permutations, has never lost sight of that. I think where we sometimes, and where, say, socialism can maybe speak to this better sometimes, is we sometimes can be a bit blind to what's making people angry isn't that they're poor as such, it's that they feel powerless. and that they feel like they're under the thumb of someone else, and they feel, to our conversation, unsure of their standing in the world. I think liberalism sometimes lacks the language to speak to that. But then to your last point about Trump and white nationalism, certainly. And I mean, we've talked, not us, but like there has been a lot of talk about, are we now entering a post-liberal age, and so on. I think we need to be clear about what the alternatives are, and the alternatives can be very, very bad indeed. And I think, very often the critics of liberalism compare, socialists do this all the time, they compare existing liberalism to utopian socialism. They say, well, liberalism in reality does X, Y, Z, but when my exact form of consumer communism comes to power, all those things will be solved. And like, it has to be apples to apples. Either we're comparing a liberal utopia to a socialist or a communist one, or we're comparing the reality of socialism, which can be quite good, if you wanted to point at the Nordic states, and it can be quite bad if you wanted to point at the Soviet Union. But it has to be real world to real world, or utopia to utopia. But to be clear, if liberalism goes away, what is coming after it is not a socialist utopia. We know what's on the other side of the liberal order failing, and it is the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, or in my country of the UK, people who tried to set fire to hotels with refugees inside them precisely because there were refugees inside them. It's that. And it is as ugly and dangerous as people say, and I for a long time have been a strong advocate on the side of, no, we are not being alarmist, it really is alarming.
Yeah, David Foster Wallace tried to resolve some of this, although not a philosopher, but someone who thought about the sense of alienation and liberalism in a liberal society. And his solution was essentially that you have to go outside. You have to make community bonds. And even though liberalism can be alienating in some sense, you have to go outside. You have to actually shake people's hands. You have to do physical contact. You have to engage in community gardens, and you have to build community, and you have to participate in all these clubs. And that Robert Putnam had written a brilliant book, Bowling Alone, about the death of the social club. So that's become harder over time. But Wallace's point is that you actually have to do the work, which gets back to your point about Mill, is that sometimes this is very exhausting. And it's difficult. And if you exist in a world where the default is staying at home and looking at your computer screen versus having to go to church every Sunday, at least, like you're forced to, you just have to get up and go do that stuff, which is kind of annoying. And it's the same with, to bring it back to fashion, the world is much more confusing. There are so many more choices. This can be very anxiety inducing. Unfortunately, that also just, you can't opt out. I think it's totally fine to opt out and not care about clothing at all. But if you do want to dress better, it does mean that there's a lot more burden on the individual. You have to figure out the aesthetic language. You have to figure out how things fit. You have to do a lot more research. And that's the kind of exhausting part of liberalism and kind of Mill system. It is the unfortunate, but you're right. I totally agree. Sometimes the alternative, I do sometimes think oh man, I wish I was in that ideal community where we all held hands. But sometimes you set up that community and you're outside the group. You're not, they've set up a norm that excludes you, and it is not something that you can opt into because of real exclusionary aspects of identity that you cannot even change. It's not that I can just elect to believe in this group. It's that I am outside of it by definition. And that's the unfortunate, scary part.
Yeah, and, community sounds great until you find yourself on the wrong side of it, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, look, there's something obviously correct about Bowling Alone, right? And it seems to be getting more correct, right? Post-COVID, post everyone having phones, whatever. I guess I would want to call our attention to the fact that the people politically who beat that drum the loudest are leveraging it for ugly political projects and are not doing anything to preserve the communities that we do have. I'll give you an example for my own life. I worked for the Church of England for a year. Long story. The Church of England is in terminal decline. Like, membership is half what it was 30 years ago, is half before that. It'll be extinct within another generation. If the people who talk about preserving British traditions and preserving British culture, there is like so much. We have so much heritage in this country, and there is so much to be done to protect it. Like, just off the bat, do you have any idea how much it costs to like keep 1,000-year-old listed building like not falling down, you know? And then there were lived traditions. The ancient cathedrals have been singing evensong for 700 years now. Like, I'm not even super religious personally, but that seems like a nice thing we should be continuing.
Yeah.
The volunteer labour that goes into making those choirs possible and keeping them happening is staggering, and the pure financial cost of literally having the cathedral not fall down. The people who are saying, like, oh, we want English tradition and English culture and so on, do not lift a finger to help with any of just the hard work of actually maintaining the traditions and heritage. That I agree. I don't want to see that stuff go away. It's a rhetorical cudgel to say we don't like immigrants, and honestly, by immigrants, there's a fine line between that and just people who don't look like us. You know, like, really, when it comes down to it, they're uncomfortable that they're walking down the high street and there's an Asian grocery store. Like, that's what it is, and I'm all up for a mature conversation about how we do preserve the types of community and heritage that we have left, because we are failing in that respect. But I don't think that's a problem of liberalism as such. I think it's just that's hard. It's difficult. It's even more difficult to build communities from scratch. Anyone who's done any organising work will tell you that. And even preserving the ones that we do have, like, talk to any Church of England pastor about like how difficult it is to like expand any of the groups that they do, you know? I think that is just hard, and I'm up for a conversation about that. I don't think it's liberalism as such that stops it, but I just think we have to pay attention to the way that those concerns are being leveraged for political projects that not only will not help with that, but will harm a great many other people in the process.
I am religiously, I'm
Yeah.
agnostic, but I've participated in many. I went to church when I was young. I've been to Buddhist temples. I took a class on Islamic law. I've been interested in religion for a very long time, and I've greatly admired the kind of community aspect of religious groups. I hear the same is true of Catholic churches in the United States, that they're very expensive to maintain as just like as a operation, and that many of them are essentially having to open themselves up for tours that they charge for, that they open up their spaces as like community centers for people to do yoga. They're like repositioning their space so that they can essentially try to make enough money to keep the operation going. And it does seem that the kind of like the declining numbers of people who, so I think even in the U.S., you're seeing these religious spaces kind of refashion themselves so they can bring in other revenue streams. But it does also seem like the declining number of people who actually attend religious services and donate to the organization will make it more difficult for them to sustain themselves. And I share your concerns. I think it's good to maintain those traditions and those community spaces. And yeah, to bring it to David Foster Wallace's point, people just have to go out in this unfortunate system, even if there's not a better one. You just have to go out and do the actual work of participating in communities, and um, on the much more superficial, less kind of important element of fashion, if you want to build a wardrobe, there is more of an onus on you to then do that kind of work. When you can wear anything you want and you're not forced to one uniform, you then have to figure out how do I want to build a wardrobe that's not just around whatever fashion editors dictate and moving trends, and how do I want to dress that communicates something that is more meaningful to me?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And I think, as liberals, we don't want to dismiss the communitarian concerns. But yeah, I also do want to sort of put them in both philosophic and practical context, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, should we should we pause there? That was a good 2 hours. And
Yeah.
I feel like that was sort of a resolution point. Yeah, listen, Derek, thank you so much for coming on. You're bigger than me online, but for listeners who haven't heard of you, do you want to direct them to Twitter, Blue Sky, website, anything like that?
Sure. So most people probably know me through Twitter, and my handle there is dieworkwear, DIEWORKWEAR. And then I also have my own website where you can go to dieworkwear.com, which is where I write about men's clothing. But most people probably have much more, if you're interested in improving your dress, most people probably have much more practical, kind of like, how do I dress better? And if you're looking for that kind of writing, my service writing, as they call it in the journalism industry, my service writing, you can find that at putthison.com. And that's PUTTHISON.com. And then if you just go to the Start Here link, you'll essentially, it's our onboarding page, if you will, where you can then just dive in. There's a top bar at the very top of the website with the drop down menus, and if you search there and you go to guides and best of, you'll find other stuff that I think can help you build a better wardrobe.